All right, this is part two of planned socialism and the Soviet Union. We left off with Stalin's Great Break. Uh, Joseph Stalin was installed as the leader of the Soviet Union from 1929 to 1940, and under his reign he opted for socialism in one country. His goal here was to pursue a more practical form of communism. Rather than try and conquer the world, he was going to simply try to conquer the Soviet Union. It doesn't mean that they didn't involve themselves in world affairs. There was consultants sent to many countries to assist in implementing and devising socialist regimes. But overall, the focus was on getting the Soviet Union to be a global power economically and militarily, rather than trying to spread communism across the world. Stalin also abandoned the new economic policy that Lenin had put into place. Remember, it was that policy that relaxed some of the constraints on market forces and caused the government to focus more on the heavy industries, the commanding heights, rather than micromanaging individual small businesses. It also increased productivity that helped bring the economy back from a devastating blow in the initial years of the Soviet Union. So Stalin is abandoning that and bringing back the totalitarian government, attempting to control all sectors of the economy. In essence, he's trading off productivity for power and control. And this is nothing new. Most people, when they hear the name Joseph Stalin, they associate that with a confiscation of power, not a relinquishment of such. In order to do this, though, you've got to get a lot of people on your side, and you've got to convince them that the economic sacrifices are going to be worth it. So a cult of personality is the way to do this. And this is using propaganda and marketeering in order to establish support for the leadership. This goes beyond just, advertising. And sometimes cities are named in honor of these figures, history books rewritten, government controls the media and only presents the leadership in a positive light. That happens today too. If we talk about China as being probably the most totalitarian system in terms of population in the world, they do a really good job of managing the information that makes its way to over 1 billion people. So this began in large part with Stalin, who had a huge population to convince that his ideas were in their best interest. He collectivized farms, confiscated private property. This did lead to a peasant rebellion. Farmers are isolated and have a lot of freedoms that are not available to those in maybe a more urban or manufacturing setting. It's much easier for a leader to control a large city than it is for them to control farmers across millions of acres of farmland. So farmers are used to a lot of independence, and when you try to go in and confiscate property and take control, there's much more unrest and the potential for rebellion. So that did happen, and one of the ways that Stalin led or dealt with these dissenters was through the secret police. You may know of the secret police as the KGB. The KGB were not police in the traditional sense of protecting people from other people or protecting the nation from outsiders. They were there to ferret out political and economic enemies, dissidents. And there's a variety of techniques they used to do this, but there were strong incentives to rat out people that were doing things inconsistent with the leadership. Kind of like today, how if you contact the IRS and report somebody that's cheating on their taxes, they'll share with you some of the lot that they get. Stalin is attempting to create a new Soviet person, a new breed of worker, expert manager who shares the idealistic goal of building socialism and will work unselfishly for that goal, honest, comradely, and heroic. This person is sometimes referred to as Homo Sovieticus. Bit of a play on words because we know Homo economicus refers to the rationally self-interested man. So this would be the man who is unselfishly working to support socialism. Vladimir Lenin used this kind of propaganda to build the initial Soviet ideal. He's quoted as saying, "For the first time after centuries of working for others, of working in subjugation for the exploiter, it has become possible to work for oneself, and moreover to employ all the achievements of modern technique and culture in one's work." Again, marketeering to try to get people on board with the new agenda, the collectivist agenda. Stalin combined the assumption of Homo Sovieticus, right, the perfect person that supports the nation, with party infallibility. Party cannot go wrong. This combination led to some of the largest purges of people in history. And, it's unfortunate that we have to see a photo like this, but, there's evidence to support that there were mass executions. A lot of these mass graves have been found. Stalin is certainly not revered in history for his light hand. He was a very heavy-handed ruler that just backed that up with the threat of execution. He's not the only one in history, but certainly when you're trying to take control of an economy, there's multiple ways of doing it, and he was one that used the stick more than the carrot. In 1935, he declared cadres decide all, blaming economic failures on enemies of the people and justifying the mass imprisonment and slaughter of over 2 million people from 1935 to 1938 alone. This is just a map to show you the size and geographic area of the Soviet Union. You probably recognize a lot of these countries. Today they're independent countries, but back then they were part of the larger Soviet Union. I also put here a timeline of the leadership, and you can get a sense of the major figures here. There's lesser known figures in between some of these periods, but for the most part, these are the names that you should be familiar with. Next thing I want to do is talk about planned socialism as a theory. We built a capitalist model and the theory of capitalism in another section, so you know how capitalism through voluntary exchange allocates resources to produce the goods and services that we need. Here we're going to look at the attempt to plan an economy and have government do that resource allocation to satisfy people's needs. So replacing voluntary exchange with government. It's a tall order, and there's always been a controversy about the ability to do this. It's known as the socialist controversy. Can a planned socialist economy operate efficiently? That debate still goes on today, but it's not so much at the extremes. We don't usually think about capitalism versus planned socialism. We usually think today about capitalism versus some sort of subdued state of socialism, like democratic socialism or market socialism, Scandinavian socialism, that kind of thing. But back in this period, the beginning of the Soviet endeavor, there was really no clear understanding of what planned socialism could do. We didn't have the experience yet, so you definitely had more confidence on the socialist side in the idea of the government being able to plan an economy. This guy, Enrico Barone, wrote The Ministry of Production in the Collective State in 1907, and this was a mathematical demonstration that a centrally planned economy could achieve an efficient allocation of resources if it had perfect knowledge of demand schedules for all individuals, enterprise production functions, and the existing stock of producer and consumer goods. Producer goods are goods that are inputs. Consumer goods are final. Okay, so steel, iron, plastics, things like that are producer goods, whereas the car, the toys, the clothing, these are consumer goods. So if you have all three of these things, and again, perfect knowledge, then the government, centrally planned government, could create an efficient allocation. That's a tall order. Perfect knowledge of these things would be very difficult to achieve. But relative valuations were also going to be used. These relative valuations would be a substitute for market prices. Honestly, market prices are nothing more than relative valuations. If you have an apple that's $1 and an orange is $2, then you would say, well, oranges, trade for 1 apple or 2 apples, and an apple trades for half an orange. So you've got relative valuations whenever you attach a market price to something. They were going to abandon dollar figures, monetary figures, and just use ratios. So you would literally say, an apple there's 2 apples per orange, or half an orange per apple. The planning process was going to involve what we call directive planning. In other words, the leadership would set binding output targets that would need to be met by the producers all the way down the production chain. They would use technical coefficients created by engineers to determine how the inputs would be translated into output. And this was an important job because they're essentially creating the recipes for production. How much steel, for example, would you need to create cars? How much oil, for example, would you need to provide the energy production for the economy? The coefficients would typically be based on historical data, and they rarely change them. We're going to find that the production in the Soviet Union was very consistent and not dynamic, and that contrasts widely from a capitalist system, which can be very inconsistent and very dynamic. The planning process involved material balance. This is where the available inputs would balance with targeted output. To think about this, let's look at the sample table down here. We've got various goods here, the producer goods, coal, steel, machinery, and then the consumer goods. And then we have the sources, which is where we're getting these goods from. So 1,000 tons of coal was produced in this period, and we had 10 on stock. So we have 1,010 as a source for coal. Then over here we have the uses. You have the intermediate uses, and you have the final uses. Intermediate uses means that the coal, for example, is going to be used by the different industries to produce additional goods. Final uses means the coal would be used for a final use. It's not being embedded in a future product. And if we were to add all of these up, 100, 500, 50, 50, 100, and 210, you'll get the 1,010. That's your material balance. And the same is true for the other goods as well. The Soviet Union had a planning structure that had both vertical and horizontal elements. Simply put, a vertical relationship is between a superior and a subordinate, whereas a horizontal relationship is between people at the same level, say 2 subordinates. With these relations, we have transactions and trust. So a vertical transaction is where an administrative superior gives an order that is binding on the subordinate. And vertical trust is where the subordinate actually follows that order. You need both of these to have a good hierarchy and one that actually achieves the goals of the administrators. An example of this would be in the military in the US. A sergeant might order a private to do something. As long as the private follows that order without exception, we have not only a vertical transaction, the order, but we have vertical trust because it's being carried out. In contrast, horizontal transactions are conducted by subordinates at the same level of the administrative structure without the approval of administrative superiors. Using a military example again in the US, maybe a private tells another private, hey, why don't you go home early today and I'll finish up your work. Well, that's not approved by the administrator or the superior, but those kinds of horizontal transactions do occur. In order for them to be effective, though, there must be horizontal trust. That is, the subordinates must trust that this activity stays between them, even though it's not sanctioned by the superiors. When planners are trying to build a socialist economy, they want vertical transactions and vertical trust. They don't want horizontal transactions and horizontal trust. In fact, if there's too much horizontal trust, then it undermines the integrity of the hierarchy and eventually can no longer be a planned economy. One of the things that's interesting is the KGB was created to ferret out horizontal transactions and horizontal trust. Okay, that's it for this video. I will post part 3 of Planned Socialism in the Soviet Union as soon as possible. Thanks.